And continuing with the options we find here, or the exploit protection settings, just above the data execution prevention protection, we find this other option, or the control flow guard. Now, why do we need this? Well, as I said in the previous video, the data execution protection is kind of an old option. And hence, hackers are already aware of it, and in most cases, they won't try to go against it. Or in other words, they won't try to execute code into not executable pages of a process by means of corrupting that process. Not in a direct and easy manner anyway. So instead of this, they came up with another great idea. They thought that if we can make read-only or write-only parts of the memory of a process to execute our malicious code, maybe we can make the part of the memory containing executable code to make the dirty work for us. Now, basically what this means is that instead of trying to inject code into the writable area of the memory of a process, and then try to execute that code by means of corrupting the process, you would instead use the already executable part of the process while performing certain tasks. So basically, instead of your Minesweeper to innocently provide some entertainment, this could run amok throughout your system, accessing parts of it that it shouldn't, such as your files and such. Moreover, the ultimate goal of taking control of a process is making this process to open what's known as a reverse shell, or in simple terms, a Windows prompt shell such as PowerShell. Now the purpose of this, and as you may imagine, is that once you get this shell, well, you can basically do anything you want. So in either case, whether you corrupt the process and try to make the writable only part of it to also execute your code, or to corrupt directly the executable portion, you would at the end look for opening a shell within the target system. Now, having said that, what does this particular option actually does? Well, as its name may suggest, this option will ensure that the programs in the system flow or behave in the expected way for whatever program happens to be running at the time. So for example, if the notepad tries to open a Windows shell or access critical files in the system, this guard will prevent that from happening, as this is not normal behavior for a program such as this. Of course, and due to the sheer amount of applications out there, this isn't always possible since, and as you may imagine, it's not always so certain to determine what's the normal, or more precisely, mapping of each type of application that you may find. So, and while this is a great protection measure, it's just another element for helping us increase the security in our system. And of course, there's a lot more to this option than what I have briefly described, but again, we're trying to keep things as easy to understand as possible. So let's just carry on and take a look at the following option in this list. And which hopefully, and now that we have seen all that involves the two previous ones, will be easier to understand. Now if you remember, we said that in order for a hacker to corrupt a process, it first needs to inject some code into the writable portion of that process. And now that we're getting more familiar with the terms, we can further develop the topic of the basic structure of a process. So a process doesn't randomly exist in the memory of the system, as it's actually contained within a very well-known space, or what's known as a memory page, which basically translates into its own very well-defined personal space in the memory, and thus it also has a known address. And we could also say the same for the writable, executable, and readable portions of the process. So in summary, everything has an address and particular space in the memory of the system. Hence, when you're trying to inject code into the writable portion of a process, you should know in advance its address in the memory, because otherwise, you might be trying to inject code into the read-only pages of that process. So knowing this address beforehand is quite needed. And if you are already familiar with the process, this might not be so difficult to find out, except if the address has been randomized by means of having a different address every time the process starts. Then you might never be able of finding the right part to inject or corrupt. Of course, many people figure this out and begin making their applications so they inherently present this behavior, or randomizing the address space of the process. But again, because in spite of being part of the best practices, this is not a standard that is being enforced by law or anything like that, there are many programs that doesn't present this behavior, and even more, that may not work at all if this behavior were to be implemented. So, and as we can see here, that's the reason why this option is not active by default, because if we use it, some of our programs may no longer work, as it will force the randomization of all the respective processes. Now, this also illustrates the idea of why is that we need so many protection measures, and if these already exist, why not simply use them all the time? Well, as you can see, it isn't that simple. Although on the bright side, we don't have to enable this protection for the whole system, as there's actually the option of doing so for just some applications. Nevertheless, and before we go into that, there's still many other options here available that we need to address. See you in the next video.